Hello, check. Namah Shri Atirajaya Vivekananda Sure Satchet Sukhaswarupaya Swami Tapaharine. So we were proceeding with this lecture of Vivekananda, Maya and Freedom. And the last time we had come to rather a culminating point where, after having dealt with this idea of Maya, he comes to the main focus of the lecture, which is freedom. And he addresses this in terms of an answer to a question: from what does the universe arise, in what does it subsist, and into what it melts away? And the answer he gives is that it's in freedom. So from freedom it arises, in freedom it subsists, and in freedom it melts away. And we had mentioned that this question, from what does it arise, and in what it subsists, and in what it melts away, this echoes a question from, or a theme from the Taittiriya Upanishad, where basically yato va imani bhutani jayante yena jatani jivanti yam prayanti abhisangvishanti. It's basically a free translation of that is exactly this: from what it arises, in what it subsists, in what it melts away. And then the answer is given, tat brahmeti, and then the instruction, tat vijignasasva. Know that. The only simple instruction in any of this Vedanta literature is to know that. Know that not in terms of some kind of a speculative philosophy, but knowing it as part and parcel of one's being. Because what one is inquiring into is the truth and substance of one's being itself. So we have been speaking about these things rather glibly, and I think it's important that we understand what we mean by inquiry, what we mean by analysis. And roughly, there are sort of three broad streams of analysis that constitute various fields of study in our day-to-day life. One, which is essentially the process of scientific inquiry, takes some kind of a phenomenon, objective phenomenon that we see outside, and then we posit theories as to why such and such a thing happens, and then the theory is supposed to explain various things that do happen, and is also supposed to have some predictive power, which means basically it predicts certain phenomena, and those are supposed to be either verifiable or falsifiable. That contributes strength to a scientific theory. This idea of falsifiability was brought up by this great philosopher of science called Karl Popper many years back, but that's really the sum and substance of the scientific method of investigation, particularly in its focus on various phenomena that obtain in the physical world. But from this, see, basically the method of inquiry is going to be done by the human mind. So it's not something completely unassociated with this method that is going to come into existence when we do some other kind of inquiry. So we must bear in mind the scientific method. What does it do? It takes a bunch of existing facts. For the time being, disregard that we have this special qualifier in the physical world. So disregard that. Just collect a bunch of facts, phenomena, without any explanation. Just a bunch of facts. And then try to understand what is the underlying unity between these diverse phenomena. Let me illustrate by an example. So, suppose you pick up this paperweight here, take it to the side and let it fall. It's going to be attracted to the ground, it falls down to the ground. The same thing happens when leaves fall from a tree. And so on. So various things fall to the ground and we give it a name. We give this phenomenon a name. We call it gravity. And then the question arose, well, what about these planetary bodies that spin around the sun? And so the notion of force at a distance came into being, and the theory of gravity was propounded by Newton many centuries back. What did it do? It took these diverse phenomena, a, a leaf falling from a tree, a paperweight being dropped by a person, and very strangely, something which does not look at all related, namely the moon going around the earth, or the earth going around the sun. These phenomena, physically observable concrete phenomena, can be unified by this piece of a little equation called determining the equation of gravity. Basically, it explains that, look, you can take this little piece of concept and use it to unify these diverse phenomena that you see around yourself. This unification of diverse phenomena in a little theory is basically the aim and end of any kind of scientific inquiry, which takes as its raw data observed phenomena and then comes to something which can be written down on paper, passed from one generation to another as some little code that encapsulates a huge amount of information. This unification of a large amount of information in a little pithy theory is what is called knowledge. As I said, you need not restrict this particular methodology to the physical universe itself. So let's now proceed to the second kind of inquiry. I said that there's sort of roughly 3 broad streams of inquiry that are relevant to us in our lives. So the second one is, we as all individual human beings are familiar with at least our own minds. We say that we have a mind, and this mind behaves sometimes well, sometimes badly, which means that there are these mental forces that are acting upon us every moment of our existence. Lack of familiarity with one's own mind and how it works is a sure shot formula for a kind of disaster, which means basically that we do not know where we'll be, how we'll be behaving the next moment. A certain measure of control and authenticity comes when we are aware that my mind behaves in such and such way. And there are universal laws behind this too. This is the theory of psychoanalysis, psychology. So the first one was the analysis executed in the external physical world. The second is a method of inquiry and analysis, roughly the same, where the object of inquiry consists of mental phenomena. And what we are discussing now belongs to the third kind of inquiry, which is basically philosophical. Essentially, it consists of questions that are fundamental to our subjective experience, subjective being, right? So the first, objective knowledge, which means through our senses, the external world. And then there's this instrument that gathers that information, namely the mind, analysis of that. And then finally, an attempt to understand what our subjective experience is like in the most universal terms. What are the kinds of questions that are asked here? And each fundamental question leads to a field of philosophy. So for instance, ontology. This is the philosophy of being. And the question is, what does it mean to say I am? What does it mean to say for something is? What does it mean to be? The verb to be. What does it really mean? And we use it in our day-to-day life without enquiry, because we can get by in the world without really enquiring into some such thing. On the other hand, these fundamental questions become rather significant at certain turns of our life. Let me just illustrate by a few other questions and few other fields of analytical philosophy, and then we'll come back to this. Say the field of epistemology. This is the field that deals with human knowledge. What does it mean to say that I know? What does it mean to say that something is true? This great agnostic philosopher Bertrand Russell, there's this book of his called An Inquiry into Meaning and Truth. So what does it mean? What does meaning mean? What does truth mean? And the analysis of any of these questions really boils down or really goes back to analysis of our state of being, into what is the universal, subjective human experience. A human being, any human being says that he or she is. Any human being would say he or she knows or does not know. But what do these statements fundamentally mean? So these fundamental aspects, and let's sort of give that some kind of a framework, these fundamental aspects of human consciousness, the questions that try to understand these are what we shall call philosophical enquiry. And here, when this question is being asked, Yato vai mani bhutani jayante, or from what does this world arise, in what does it subsist, in what does it melt away, the answer that is being expected could be of two kinds. First, what is the origin of this universe within the framework of space-time and causation? Which means that we are asking this question but assuming that this physical world as it exists, as it's presented before our eyes, before our senses, is our starting point, and we'll try to find an answer within this framework which we decide to put on ourselves, namely the framework of space-time and causation. Or we could take the third point of view and see the same question but now as a means of philosophical enquiry, which does not mean that we are asking this question as something in terms of an objective appearance, an objective subsistence, and an objective melting away. So in order to expand these questions and try to get the philosophical spin on it, the real questions that we are asking here are the following. How does the world appear suddenly in my consciousness, in my field of awareness? How does it continue to subsist? What is the substratum of my existence that says that the world comes into being, subsists for a while, and then melts away? This philosophical enquiry is the subject of this discussion. So I think there is a great chance of conflating the first and the last point of view, namely that one could try to ask for an answer assuming a certain objective framework, namely the framework of space-time and causation, or try to probe deeper and try to get to an answer to the question which is fundamentally subjective, not objective. I am seeing this room around me. I am seeing these lights shining in front of me. There's a road in front and there are cars passing. This is the objective piece of information. But if we withdraw a little from that, same statements can now be rephrased by saying this room appears in my consciousness. These bulbs shine forth and they appear in my consciousness. The cars pass, but then I add to all these things in my consciousness. This point of stressing it is that it is in this subjective awareness that the world appears, the world subsists, and the world melts away, vanishes. And then the question that is being asked really, and the way that the question has been reformulated, it basically says that it is this subjective consciousness in which something appears, in which something subsists, in which something melts away or vanishes. And so the answer to all the questions from a philosophical point of view, from the point of view of philosophical inquiry, would really be consciousness itself. So what does that mean? So then the answer to any of these questions would lead to this specific word which we use very often, but we don't quite have a grasp on. Namely, what does it mean to say that it is my consciousness? And here we had cited last time something called this hard problem of consciousness, formulated by this philosopher, cognitive scientist, David Chalmers in New York University, where basically the scientific paradigm, namely the one where we talk about objective phenomena and a method of inquiry which could be verified or falsified in terms of experiments or phenomena that one could check in the objective world, the paradigm that is left out of all of this is precisely this subjective consciousness. But it is this subjective consciousness that adds value to anything that we see. The notion of something valuable, the notion of something that has meaning in personal lives is not something that one can find outside. It's not there in the objective world, but it is something that is fundamental in our subjective experience. And it is isolating this paradigm from the rest, and whether such a thing is at all possible or not, is exactly what is a ramification of this hard problem of consciousness. What is consciousness in and of itself? All these questions, in what does it subsist? Yato va imani bhutani jayante yena jatani jivanti yam prayanti avivasan vishanti. And we had cited a bunch of other questions last time. All of them finally boil down to an analysis of this incontrovertible fact that we have at this moment, namely that we feel that we are conscious beings with no clear understanding of what consciousness is. Why? And in a certain sense, it's a kind of a catch-22 situation. What kind of an answer are we seeking? If we had it in terms of some conceptual framework, then that conceptual framework is something that we could put down on paper. But that would be something in the visible world again. So we are not seeking a conceptual framework by which to understand consciousness, because that would not capture its essential quality that we are after. What then? And perhaps the answer is to be understood in terms of some of these fundamental functions, namely this process of inquiry itself. This process of philosophical inquiry is the closest, it's a process. So it's not something that's defined, it's not something that is cast in stone. It does not throw up a conclusion, because the conclusion is something that you can write down on paper and share with somebody else. But that does not capture the essence of this subjective experience that I am conscious. Or even more fundamentally, I am. This isness, this amness, this piece of knowledge that I have at every moment of time is not going to be captured by any conceptual framework. which makes the problem hard. Fair enough, but the process of enquiry started millennia ago, and it still continues because these fundamental problems bother us. Why do they bother us? Not in our day-to-day lives. But then, as we said, say a loved one passes away, and the question comes to mind, is that person, does that person continue to be? Or has that person ceased to exist? And trying to understand that question really leads us to this more fundamental question: what does it even mean for that person to exist? What does it mean for that person to be when he or she was alive? And then we are led to a certain subjective response. It is, suppose for instance, somebody has passed away a 1,000 miles away, and I did not ever know him or her. Such a person's being or not being, how does it even affect me? I don't know. I didn't know that he or she existed. I don't know now whether he or she continues to exist. So then when we say that, when this question becomes valuable to us, what we really want to know is something about ourselves. Somebody exists in our consciousness as somebody who is alive. That has certain implications. If I go to a such and such place, I will be able to speak to him or her, interact. That has a certain implication for me in my present existence now. So when we say that such and such, when we really ask this question, does such and such person exist, continue to exist now that I know that he or she is dead, this question actually really reflects back on us. And it's there that the answer should be sought. The question being, what do I even mean when I say I exist? Because the existence of all this person who we are inquiring about depends in some fundamental subjective way on my existence. So, in Vedanta, these fundamental, we had mentioned, we'll probably mention that again next time, in a few minutes. But when the enquiry, the philosophical enquiry is carried out within the framework of Vedanta, or in the context of, as we were saying last time, Madhyamika Buddhism, typically, the question takes one of two forms, as we said, ontological or epistemological. What does it mean for something to be? Isness versus not isness. Yeah? Inquiry into truth is exactly that. The word satya has the same root as isness, sat. Yeah? The Sanskrit root is called as, that which is. So what does it mean for something to be? This is a fundamental ontological question. Or this is Sat Atmak Vichar, or the other is Chit Atmak. What does it mean for something, for me to know something? Know something as true. Truth is what unifies both of these things. What does it mean for me to know? Yeah? So this is versus what is not correct knowledge. So what is correct knowledge versus what is not correct knowledge? And then there are these. So these are the two fundamental aspects along which analysis is made. And you might be wondering, well, we have this, in the Platonic triad, there is this, the good, the true, the beautiful. Yeah? So what about beauty? In the Sanskrit literature, that's referred to as ananda, so, or bliss or joy. And there is an analysis of that too, particularly in the Taittiriya Upanishad. But most of the analysis is focused on what does it mean for something to be, sat or versus asat. And the other is conscious versus unconscious, chit versus achit. So now let's revisit a bunch of questions that we had sort of highlighted from the various Upanishads last time, and try to understand these questions in this particular kind of framework. And also, what is the kind of answer that we are expecting? Yeah? So, two things. First, a question actually defines a framework of enquiry, a method of enquiry. See, otherwise, our minds are accustomed to sort of flitting here and there. So, unless there's a clear, well defined question whose answer we are interested in, and we also have a certain understanding of what is the kind of answer we want, then it defines a certain it gives a certain disciplining to the mind, and the enquiry is made in a way that it becomes meaningful. It addresses a felt problem. Without that, it will just be some kind of a speculation. It will not give something that is satisfactory at the end. So let's revisit those questions again. What did we start with? We started with this question from the Kathopanishad. Yeah? Yeyam prete vichikitsa manushye asti tyeke nayam asti jaike. Yeah? This is supposed to be this story where Nachiketa asks Yama that after one dies, some people say that he is, some people say that he is not. What is true about it? And then the answer to this question is not in terms of some anecdotes, some stories, but leading the enquirer into the foundations of that question. What does is mean? When you say that he is or he is not, what really are you trying to understand? And for that, a certain training of the mind is necessary, which is why his answer, Yama's answer starts with Shreyascha Preyascha Manushyameth. See, there's the pleasant and there's that which conduces to good. This question that was asked, Yeyam Prete, when one dies, does one continue to exist or does that person cease to exist? The question is about the fundamental nature of existence itself. So in our classification of types of questions, this is asking for Sat versus Asat. What is versus what is not. That's the framework of the enquiry. And the answer is then given in terms of a certain training of the mind that is necessary. A method of enquiry is given. See, very often in any of these philosophical debates or discussions, a certain answer is given and the rest of the time is spent on trying to analyze what these words mean. This very often becomes a kind of a dry and sterile speculation. On the other hand, if the answer is given in terms of a process, a mental process of training the mind towards a method rather than a conceptual framework that will give an answer, then that method itself is going to lead the person enquiring to some answer which will satisfy the enquirer. This prescription of a method of enquiry is much more satisfactory than a piece of speculative philosophy. Speculative philosophy has abounded for more than a couple of millennia. It has not satisfied us even today. Why? Because the answer given in terms of this speculation is not something that is real to us. And the only thing that will satisfy us if we are really interested in an answer to a question is this subjective feeling that yes, this is true. Which means that the mind needs to be trained in order to inquire systematically. Take any scientific discipline, physics, mathematics, or for that matter, any social science, history. There is a certain framework that is defined, a certain method of inquiry that is defined, so that words that one uses are in a particular sense and they become meaningful to us subjectively. The same kind of thing needs to be done here. So if we really want an answer to this question, then the first thing that needs to be done is to train the mind in order to have a meaningful method of inquiry, hopefully leading to a satisfactory resolution, at least subjectively. Which is why the answers are given in terms of these methods rather than something in terms of some kind of a conclusion. So the conclusion itself, just as a bunch of words, is not what is going to be important. The method which we can imbibe and use as a meaningful method of inquiry is much more significant. All right. So that was Yayam Prete. That was from the Kathopanishad. Yeah? So then the Kena Upanishad also has a question like this. Kena ishitam patati preshitam manaha. By propelled by or impelled by what does this mind act? Does this mind meditate? Does this mind think? Impelled by what do these senses work? Which means, what is the question that is being asked? It's essentially saying that, look, we have these instruments of knowledge. The mind is an instrument of knowledge. The senses are an instrument of knowledge. Impelled by what do they work? What is the substance behind this process? So we basically say that, look, the process of acquiring knowledge in the external world, just move back a little bit, it's these senses, it's our mind. But is that really what is acquiring knowledge? Suppose I'm unconscious and my eyes are open, I will not register. What is that flash which says, I know this room around me? Where does that flash of knowledge come from? This is not a question about Sat Asat. This is the Chit Achit kind of framework. Basically, what is the framework of knowledge? What does it mean for me to know in an instant? The answer in the Kena Upanishad is also given in these terms. Pratibodha viditam matam. Through every act of knowledge, that consciousness is known. It's just that our minds are accustomed to rush forward without dwelling on that momentary flash. So it rushes forward and gets muddled in the external objective phenomena because that's our way of thinking. But it points a finger in the direction in which we can seek an answer. So the answer that is given is Pratibodha Viditam. Through every act of consciousness, through every act of knowledge, through every act of awareness, this knowledge flashes, this consciousness flashes. All that we need to do is catch hold of it. Catch hold of that specific phenomenon in our psyche. So when we say that, look, what does it mean for me to know? What this is pointing a finger to is, look at this particular phenomenon, this experimental phenomenon that's happening in you every moment. How do we catch hold of it? And various methods have been formulated, and we'll just mention a few because these are sort of very simple to say, very difficult to practice. Yeah? So in the Buddhist tradition, there's this thing called mindfulness, remaining aware, practicing awareness. So doing whatever one does with full awareness. If I am speaking into a mic, I am supposed to be fully aware that I am doing this at this moment. If there is a book in front of me, I am supposed to be fully aware that there is this book in front of me. Is it repeating these words? No. It is trying to find out within my awareness, within my experience at this moment, this particular objective thing that is there with me all the time. This particular subjective thing that is there with me all the time. Vivekananda in his Karma Yoga essentially says the same thing but in a somewhat different language. He says, whenever you're doing any work, do it with full attention. These two things, attention and awareness, have been identified as the two primary functions, modes of functioning of consciousness. Awareness, without prejudice, without bias, and attention, which means focusing. These two phenomena, whichever you want to, whichever you like, catch hold of it, and that will give the answer. So the answer that is given to this kena ishitam patati preshitam manaha is a method or a bunch of methods. Take whichever you like. Doing anything with full awareness or full attention, whichever you like to call it. Finally, attention is the more dynamic and awareness the more static aspect of the same consciousness. But it is a method of catching hold of this one thing in our subjective experience, which is the answer to this question. And hence this answer, pratibodha viditam matam, is why is that particular mantra the answer to this original question? And this is the discussion that we say. Okay, fine. If somebody is more devotionally inclined, so for example, the Christians speak about practice of the presence of God. It's essentially the same thing. That's a more devotional or theological way, or more devotional or dualistic way of saying essentially the same thing. But it's really this maintaining of awareness at every moment of our existence. That's the answer to this question. It's a method. And then, so we had enumerated this bunch of other things, and so there's this other question which I had forgotten to mention last time from the Mundaka. What is it knowing which we get to know everything? This is there in the Mundaka. Basically, again, this is an epistemological inquiry. This is the chit-based inquiry. Yeah? So when we say, what is that knowing which we know everything? Huh? What we are really asking for is, what is the foundation of my subjective faculty of knowledge? Again, the answer therefore is consciousness itself in its function, in its capacity to acquire knowledge. Yeah? Again, so therefore it's a chit atmak vichar or chit atmak jigyasa that is being focused upon. Another such thing is, we had mentioned this last time, it bears repetition. This is from the Brihadaranyaka. Vijñāta avramare kena vijaniyat. How does one know the knower? It's essentially the same question. Same question as in Mundaka, phrased in somewhat different language. Why? Because people have different ways of thinking. So they come up with these same fundamental questions, but worded differently. Again, knower. How does one know the knower? Personally, I like this last formulation best because it comes closest to this hard problem of consciousness as a faculty of knowing. How does one know the knower? So there's this set of questions in the various Upanishads. Each of them defines for you, allows you to focus your mind on a particular question whose answer, and this is what's important, whose answer one is interested in. If it's just some abstract question and we indulge in a bunch of speculative philosophy, We would have written tomes at the end of it, and we'd be none the wiser. If, on the other hand, what we are really after is some subjective satisfaction that, look, this question really bothers me, and I need an answer to this, which is why the first question that Nachiketa asked is perhaps very significant, because this issue about people ceasing to be, people dying and ceasing to be, in our usual objective sense, is something that most of us have some experience or the other. And so that question adopts a certain significance in a very practical sense. And then, say, here's another kind of thing. Today, you have a huge amount of information and misinformation coming along in the form of newspaper articles, Facebook posts, etc., etc. How do we determine which of these is true and which of these is not? What kind of knowledge shall I say is true? What kind of knowledge shall I say is false? So today, this Chit Achit Vichar is more important than ever before, because we live in an information age and we do not have the inbuilt tools to sieve and take that which is true out of them, out of that miasma of information that floats around. The question then is, are we interested in the truth? Or is it that we are interested in what we like? Narratives spun around in the head can only maybe emphasize something we like to be true. But is that something that's going to satisfy us? A pleasant story saying that, oh, if somebody, say for example, children are often told, I mean, there are unfortunate children whose parents die young, or a sibling dies. This has happened during the wars, during any normal period also. And the child is told, so and so is now in one of those stars, and now a new star has appeared. That's supposed to be your sibling or your parent. Yes, the child, for the time being, believes that story, and the pain is eased. This is certainly factual. But as the child grows up, the story no longer satisfies. This question that Nachiketa asks is emergent from this lack of satisfaction. Not a question that will be satisfied by stories. Not a question that will be satisfied by anecdotes. But subjective enquiry arriving at something which one knows to be true. Yeah? So again, in Vedanta there's this prayojana. Yeah? So this is called the Anubandha Chatushtaya. One of these things is prayojana. Need. What do I need to know? Why do I need to know that? I mean, what is the relationship of this particular process of enquiry that you're telling me to the question that I'm asking? This is called the sambandha. Anyway, these are technical words, not very important, but it's fairly common sense. Essentially, the first thing that we're asking is, okay, what is the need that I have today that will be met by following this process? This question must be, the answer to that must be as clear as possible in one's own head, in one's own mind. Second, the relationship of this method of enquiry, this vidya, this process of enquiry that you're teaching me, how is it related to that question? That relationship must also be clear. Why? Because that will keep us motivated during this process of enquiry. And then, once one has all these things in place, then the answer starts making sense. And so when it says here that in freedom the world arises, in freedom the world persists or subsists, in freedom it melts away. What it will give us is a certain subjective sense of freedom that we have all experienced in some form or the other, and say that, okay, this is the locus that I need to catch hold of in my subjective consciousness. There are all these thoughts that go around in our heads, in our hearts. Which piece of awareness are we supposed to identify as the real answer to our questions? Yeah? So for that, so let me just summarize, because we've covered a bunch of things which form the background to these inquiries today. First, you should understand that this kind of Vedantic analysis or Madhya Buddhism analysis, it's a kind of philosophical inquiry, one. Two, the answers that are expected are not speculative philosophy. What then? These have to be something that has to be there as something experiential and fundamental in our day-to-day lives. Not something mystical, not something shadowy. The answer that one is seeking has to have clarity. So it's muddled up in a bunch of other things, separating it out. This separating it out is what's called Viveka, discrimination, analysis. Separate out the dross, throw it away as not valuable, and focus on that which is valuable in terms of what? Valuable not in a vacuum. Valuable in terms of the question that we had initially asked. And now this question that we ask, are we asking this as just some kind of idle curiosity? Or is it of real interest to us? If it is of real interest to us, the question is going to keep on persisting. We will not be satisfied with some stopgap answer. And we had said basically that there are these two forms of inquiry that are there in the Upanishads. One is ontological, one is epistemological. And essentially, all the basic questions there fit into largely these two frameworks. Next week, I will not be here. We'll return to this after. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna.